other panelists that I must welcome before I go to the DDG at DOJ, we'll be having a panel discussion, and we have with us, which will be coordinated by my colleague, the advocate Shireen Said at Constitutional Development. She will introduce a panel, but they include people like Professor Mandla Makhanya from the Public Service Commission, Professor Madlingozi, Commissioner, South African Human Rights Commission, Mr. Nishan Bolton, Executive Director at Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. So we are very happy to have a panel of that caliber, and also from UNHCR, Francis Igiriogu. So without further ado, we are hosting this webinar in conjunction with the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. And I've mentioned Advocate Shireen Said, the DDG Constitutional Development, who has a very more than 28 years of experience in development, human rights, and social justice. This has been accumulated both in South Africa and the United Nations. So she also holds a BA, LLB, LLM degrees. She's highly qualified in this field. I'm saying this because as the NSG, you know how we promote professionalization in the public service. She joined DOJ in December, and she heads the branch Constitutional Development in that department. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to DDG Advocate Said to extend a warm welcome and also opening remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. Though I think that would have been meant for our DG as well, who extends his apologies. He was meant to be here dealing with the keynote with the keynote address and your welcome. But unfortunately, you just have me to do that and throughout the moderation for today. The DG also to Advocate Tlakula extends his apologies. He really did, and we tried until the last 15 minutes to rearrange the schedule to enable him to come here, but unfortunately there was a matter that he has to deal with in the presidency that could not be adjusted. So he was very specific in asking me to ensure that his remarks are made. So I'm going to go on to the script. So Program Director, esteemed guests, panelists, representatives of the Chapter 9 and 10 institutions, representatives of various UN agencies, members of civil society, the public, officials of the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, the National School of Government, and other departments, and all of you who have joined us online today. I want to warmly welcome you to this webinar. Today's webinar, under the theme Speak Out Against Racism, is organized by our Department of Justice and Constitutional Development in partnership with the National School of Government. The event supports and marks the start of Anti-Racism Week that takes place annually from the 14th to the 21st of March during Human Rights Month. The approved theme for 2024 is Anti-Racism Week is Learn, Speak, Act, Combating Racism Together. Anti-Racism Week has been marked annually over the past years in South Africa during Human Rights Month and culminates on the 21st of March, which you all know is marked globally as the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and commemorated in our country as National Human Rights Day. It is an annual action week aimed at creating public awareness about racism and how it affects individuals and broader society. It was initiated by the Anti-Racism Network of South Africa in 2017 and is a call to action to all sectors of society to get involved, to initiate activities that ensure that there's a countrywide focus on tackling racism and that its elimination remains on the national agenda. As you know, South Africa celebrates its 30 years of constitutional democracy this year. Human Rights Month was launched recently by the Ministers of Justice and Correctional Services and Sports, Arts and Culture on the 4th of March and will be celebrated throughout this month. Our department will be hosting a national conference on 30 years of the state of human rights in South Africa under the theme 3 Decades of Respect for and Promotion of Human Rights next week, the 18th to the 20th of March. And this will culminate in the commemoration of Human Rights Day on the 21st March in Sharpeville, Gauteng, South Africa. Well, I was dealing with the local national audience. This year marks Human Rights Day will mark 30 years since the major shift from government-sanctioned oppression, colonialism, slavery, racism, and sexism, and all other forms of human rights violations to a state that is democratic and committed to building a culture of human rights and human rights in the country. Despite 30 years of constitutional democracy, post-apartheid South Africa, sadly, is still plagued by racism. Statistics from the Human Rights Commission over a period of 8 years, from 2012 to 2020, indicate that race-related grounds remain the highest in comparison to other grounds such as ethnic or social origin, religion, gender, language, birth, culture, belief, and conscience, amongst others. In addition, the Human Rights Commission stats show that race-related complaints have steadily increased over the years, with only a very slight drop during the year 2020 to 2021. The state has adopted the National Action Plan to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. The NAP provides the basis for the development of a comprehensive national public policy against racial discrimination and signals the commitment to giving effect to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Our department is the focal agency responsible for the coordination and implementation of the NAP by all relevant role players and sectors. Its mandate is to uphold and administer the Constitution, deepen constitutional democracy, and advance and promote the values of human rights, human dignity, equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms. Since Cabinet adopted the NAP in 2019, steady progress has been made to implement the measures of the NAP. However, much more still needs to be done. And over the next 5-year cycle starting in 2024-25, the focus must be on intensifying efforts to implement and strengthen implementation. And this requires our collective commitment and efforts. The public service has a critical role to play in this regard. The National School of Government, which draws its mandate from the Constitution as well, is tasked with the responsibility of ensuring that public servants comply with the provisions of established legislation and for ensuring service delivery impact by supporting institutional performance. It is therefore appropriate and imperative for the NSG to be part of the actions around addressing racism, especially during this week. The free online service championing anti-discrimination in the public service, a course offered by the NSG, is anchored in the Constitution and the NAP, and it seeks to empower senior managers in government to deal with these challenges and ultimately to provide efficient and effective service delivery as outlined in the Batho-Pele principles, which is really inspired by Section 195 of our Constitution. The use of technology and online platforms, such as this webinar, in providing wider access to these critical discussions assists both the department and the NSG in reaching a wider audience to become actively involved in these critical discussions. It is my sincere hope that this webinar will provide a platform for raising of awareness of discrimination issues and serve as a call to action to speak out against racism with a particular focus on the public service, on the role of the public service. Through this interactive panel discussion, between various experts, advocates of equality, senior government officials. This event will provide an opportunity to share key insights and perspectives on the current programs in place, as well as the effectiveness and remaining challenges to combat racism. In conclusion, an increased level of understanding within the public service of the needs of the public and barriers affecting service delivery to the public gained through this collaborative online event will assist us as the partners in influencing the desired culture shift toward human rights and preventing racism towards one of sustainable equality initiatives in the public sector. Thank you very much. I understand. Sorry, Dr. Kaunda. Back to you.
No, over to you to introduce our guest speaker.
Yes, of course, because it's me doing it all, we're just moving from one to the next. Yes, I perhaps because it's a webinar, DG certainly will have a recording at some point in time, or he will be told, because I wanted to say the fact that he's not here gives me this great privilege to introduce our keynote speaker. Advocate Tlakula is the chairperson of the Information Regulator of South Africa. She has held several influential positions. And of course, because of the time constraints, I'm summarizing her CV, which is enormous, as is her experience. And these include of the influential positions that she's held of being a former commissioner of the South African Human Rights Commission, the chief electoral officer, and the chairperson of the Electoral Commission. Advocate Tlakula was also commissioner of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights for 12 years, where she served as the chairperson of the commission and its special rapporteur on the freedom of expression and access to information. She is currently a member of the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and recently she was appointed as a member of the SADC Electoral Advisory Committee. I'm honored, hence I was saying that DG is not here, the opportunity for me to have introduced Advocate Tlakula, who I met when in probably 1996. And I have to say, she looks as evergreen as the time that I met her. And as always, she had enamored me with her energy, her commitment to excellence, and her oratory abilities. So over to you, Advocate Tlakula. It's such a privilege to be with you in this webinar.
Thank you, and over to you, Advocate Tlakula.
Thank you very much. Of course, at my age, I have to check that I'm technologically savvy. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can see you.
Thank you very much. Let me greet everyone, Program Director. Let me also recognize the presence of all the eminent panelists and speakers who have joined us this morning. I also want to thank the Department of Justice for inviting me to this important webinar. Shireen, it's very good to see you after many years. As you have indicated, we met more than 30 years ago. And also, let me take this opportunity to congratulate Professor Mandla Ngozi on his appointment to the Human Rights Commission, since this is the first time that I'm interacting with him since his appointment. With that said, I stand on the protocol that has already been established. It has been 30 years since we emerged from a terrible history of apartheid, which was characterized by institutionalized and legislated racism, racial discrimination, racial political domination and oppression, and the economic exploitation and subjugation of the Black majority by the white minority. The adoption of the new constitution embodying the Bill of Rights at the dawn of democracy ushered hope for the ultimate bearing of the scourge of racism and racial discrimination, for the attainment of equality and justice, and for the restoration of the dignity of the oppressed and marginalized. To demonstrate its commitment towards the eradication of racism and racial discrimination, the government of the new South Africa moved with speed to ratify the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, ICED, in 1998, which is amongst the oldest UN human rights instruments adopted to target oppression and discrimination, in particular apartheid. Within the UN circles, this convention is known as the South African Convention because it was inspired by apartheid. The new constitution, which established a number of state institutions, I beg your pardon, the new constitution established a number of state institutions to support democracy. These included the South African Human Rights Commission in 1995. I had the privilege and honor of serving as one of the founding members of the commission from 1995 to 2002. Since the country was emerging from a history of racism and racial discrimination, the commission at that time took a strategic decision to prioritize anti-racism as its area of focus. We traveled the length and breadth of our country to hold public inquiries on racism and racial discrimination in various sectors, such as schools, institutions of higher learning, including residences of these institutions, police stations, farms, holiday resorts, and of course, racism in the media, which at that time became quite controversial. I am amazed that Ms. Advocate Shireen, in her opening remarks, indicated that the statistics tell us that the South African Human Rights Commission still receives a large number of complaints on racism. In fact, it was Dr. Kaunda who said that. At the time when I was a member of the commission, that was the state of affairs. In 2000, in his State of the Nation address, President Mbeki called for a national conference on racism to be convened by the South African Human Rights Commission. In announcing the conference, President Mbeki said the following, and I quote, "We are convinced that this important initiative will help move our country towards the realization of the goal contained in the Constitution of the creation of a non-racial society, as well as impact positively on our continued struggle for a non-sexist society," close quote. The national conference was held in September 2000 under the theme, "Combating Racism, a Nation in Dialogue." The conference was the first opportunity after apartheid for South Africans, both the victims and beneficiaries of apartheid, to sit in one room to discuss their experiences of racism and racial discrimination. It was a difficult conference. There was a lot of anger, and there was also a lot of tears in the room. At the conference, or after the conference, the South African Millennium Statement on Racism and Program of Action was adopted. The program of action proposed, among others, that the government and parliament must be petitioned to declare 2001 to 2010 as the decade for the national mobilization against racism. Secondly, that the South African Human Rights Commission should develop and adopt a comprehensive national action plan and strategy to combat racism. Such a plan should include, among others, indicators of success, timeframes and responsibilities, and effective monitoring and evaluation systems. The national plan and strategy was jointly developed by the Commission under the leadership of its then chairperson, Professor Bani Pichana, and the Department of Justice under the leadership of the then Deputy Minister of Justice, the late Dr. Manto Shabalala. In 2001, the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance was held in Durban. I was once again privileged to be part of the South African delegation to this conference. At the end of the conference, the much contested Durban Declaration and Program of Action was adopted, which urged states to establish and implement national policies and action plans to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances, including their gender-based manifestations. I'm saying that the conference was contested because it led to some countries in the West walking out of the conference because they did not want the word slavery to be included in the conference, and also compensation for slavery. So the negotiations for the Durban Declaration were actually very difficult. And it is interesting that 30 years almost after the adoption of the Durban Declaration, when this important conference was commemorated in New York not too long ago, 1 or 2 years ago, the same state parties walked out of that commemoration. The national plan and strategy, which was jointly developed by the Commission and the Department of Justice, formed the basis for the development of the National Action Plan and its implementation plan, which was officially launched in 2019 after its adoption by Cabinet. The NAP was adopted through extensive consultation involving government, Chapter 9 institutions, and civil society organizations. The main focus of the NAP is to tackle the issue of racism in our country by raising awareness of anti-racism and anti-discrimination issues, to enhance initiatives aimed at supporting individuals and communities facing racism, racial bias, xenophobia, and related forms of intolerance against domains such as education, health, employment, housing, food security, and social services, and the pursuit of fair legal representation and fostering greater societal equality, while reinforcing the principle of the rule of law and democratic governance. The NAP also prioritizes groups of individuals who face countless forms of discrimination, such as poor rural and urban people, farm workers, farm dwellers, people in extreme poverty, women and girls, children and youth, stateless persons, domestic workers, people living with HIV and AIDS, people living with disabilities, older persons, people deprived of their liberty, the LGBTI plus community, and people affected by armed conflict or national disasters. The NAP further emphasizes awareness raising, and that it is the responsibility of all people, not only the state, to combat racism and discriminatory practices. This year, as we celebrate the 30th National Human Rights Day, we must reflect on our achievements and challenges remaining to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Unfortunately, racism continues to rear its ugly head in schools, employment, farms, institutions of higher learning, to mention a few. It is quite interesting for me, or it was quite interesting for me to read that there were incidences of racial discrimination and racism at the University of Stellenbosch, which took the form of induction programs that perpetuated racism and racial discrimination. I was so amazed because during my time at the South African Human Rights Commission, we investigated that university and other university for the practices which at that time they called engroening in Afrikaans, which is induction, which had racial connotations. We wrote a report, and I'm amazed that almost 30 years thereafter, that institution still practices same racially induction programs, racially inspired induction programs, which means that the work that was done then, the reports that were written then, and the recommendations of the South African Human Rights Commission were left to gather dust somewhere and were not implemented. We continue to experience overt and covert forms of racism in our country and racial discrimination, including what we now call unconscious bias or othering, and contemporary forms of racism such as racial profiling and online racial hatred. The question that I have for all of us is, what is it that we are doing within our own spheres of influence to confront racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other intolerance wherever they occur? Do we look the other way and become silent bystanders? What have we done to make the NAP and its implementation plan a living document? Have we done enough to achieve the goals of the NAP? And these are the thoughts that I want to leave with you. As I conclude, I would like to remind us of the famous words of the statesman of our time, President Nelson Mandela, in his book, Long Walk to Freedom, who said, and I quote, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to human hearts than its opposite." I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to that address by Advocate Bensetlakula, which has painted a picture for us that it may be 30 years of freedom and we may have the best constitution in the world, but we are not immune from racism, and we still have so many incidents of racism, regardless of the policy, the laws, which means we still have a struggle that we must wage to fight racism. Let me, before going on, extend a warm welcome to our Director General in the Department of Public Service and Administration, Ms. Yoliswa Makasi, who has also joined us. We are happy for that because we know how busy our DJs are. And let me also, I forgot to introduce myself, by the way. My name is Lakela Kauda from the DDG at the National School of Government. As the NSG, our partnership with DOJ, Department of Justice and Constitutional Development in this venture is informed by our belief that the public service must be made free of racism, discrimination, and all forms of intolerances. And we are of the firm view that it can be taught. That if you are a South African, it doesn't mean you are automatically aware of what is racism, how does it manifest itself? Are you racist if you engage in a particular behavior? So we run this course called a course on anti-discrimination in the public service, which is online and free. You enroll at your own time. So as we engage during the program, we are also encouraging public servants in the webinar to please enroll for this course, which is very, very helpful in dealing with anti-racism, so that we can have a situation where, as a public service, if there's a water outage and certain things we take for granted, there's a water outage in a particular city, who as a public servant do you prioritize when it comes to the recovery? Is it the nearest township? Is it the nearest suburb? Some of the unconscious racism, which Advocate Tlakula was telling about, covert and overt manifestations of racism, things that we are not aware of. Advocate Tlakula has kindly agreed. She won't stay with us because she's busy, but she has kindly agreed to take a few questions or engagement. There's a Q&A there at the bottom of your screen, as you would see, where you can raise and engage any questions, but she's available for a few minutes for any questions, comments that you would like to share, so that we take advantage of her many years of experience in this field. My colleague Louise Lepan, how do we do this Q&A? Can you explain? Thanks.
Thank you very much, DDG. So the participants have a Q&A platform at the bottom of their screen. They type into their questions and we are able to see that. If there's any indication for a commissioner to speak, we are delighted to do that as well. Thank you very much, Program Director.
Thank you very much. I must indicate, as we wait for the participants, when Advocate Tlakula spoke about the Human Rights Commission and the investigations into racism in 2001. I remember that I actually appeared before them in 2001 in the inquiry on racism into the media, which was a very important inquiry, as I said before, and they had to drag editors to come and participate because they did not understand that they were not above the law and above the Constitution. So that was one of the most remarkable work that was done by Advocate Bansi Tlakula and the Human Rights Commission at the time. I see there's a question there in the chat. Why is law enforcement and the judiciary working for and protecting criminals who are sitting in parliament? A question from Hector Sampson. And then someone else is just greeting you, Advocate Tlakula. Good morning, Advocate, from Silufeli Sintumule. So there's a question for you. Why is law enforcement and the judiciary working for and protecting criminals who are sitting in parliament?
Well, that's not my area of expertise. I don't know. Maybe the Department of Justice have a view on this. All that I can say is that we are quite fortunate in this country that we have a very independent judiciary. That much I can say, and I can say without any fear of contradiction, because I have worked on the African continent as a commissioner for 12 years. And judges are having a rough time on the continent because they get instructions in some countries, not only on the African continent, but also in other parts of the world. They are executive-minded. Some of us are following the events in the US as they prepare for their elections, and how one of the candidates for these coming elections in the US packed the Supreme Court with executive-minded judges who will, be at his beck and call. And we're beginning to see now some of those judges actually exonerating former President Trump from those cases that he are before the court on influencing the outcome of the 2019 election. So in our country, the judiciary is independent, and the judiciary can only act on the cases that are brought before them. If there is no case before them, they can't act. And even when they act, their judgments depend on the evidence that is presented before them. So we have to look at the work of the South African Police Services in the manner in which they investigate offenses. We also have to look at the NAP, the NPA, the prosecutorial authority, whether they are able to prosecute those cases successfully. So that's all that I can say. And of course, in our country, corruption at many spheres, or in the private sector, in the public sector, is a big problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And there's another question from Tilufedi. I'm interested to hear from Advocate on how we can encourage the young generation to engage positively on issues of racism. We often leave this group of people behind in our intervention strategies. And then there are some other questions which would also, because we still going to have a panel discussion, and I'm happy that DG Marcus is here because some of them deal with the public service. We may save you from those. Advocate Lakula, like someone was saying, how can we deal with a manager in the public service who deliberately, based on race, excludes one from duties which form part of your job description and then continues to allow a chief director to whom you report, who misses all the deadlines, the privileges you are denied? How is the government going to combat racism in the engineering sector, where it is highly dominated by white males? Young black males who are qualified will get low salaries and no recognition compared to the white male counterparts. How does one reconcile? Sorry, how did I miss it? And there's Msali from Temba. I observe that even in our local municipalities, we always have this discussion as victims of racism, but perpetrators most of the time don't form part or willingly contribute. What other strategies can we use to ensure maximum participation, especially of the perpetrators? How crucial, another question, how crucial is it to examine the systemic elements of racism while simultaneously denouncing the daily prejudice that still exists in our nation? Does one hold greater significance than the other? From Nhlanhla Nkobi. Let me just leave those for now. Over to you, Advocate.
That's a lot. Let me start with the issue of young people, because that always fascinates me, just in terms of, you know, young people who were born after apartheid and who think that racism died with apartheid, and who go to schools that create the impression that racism does not exist. And they then daunt the reality of the existence, or the reality of existence of racism and racial discrimination dawns upon them when they join the public sector, the private sector. That's when they begin to experience it. And in my keynote, I looked at the history, where we come from, where we are, precisely because we have to educate the young people about this. And I think at their workplace, they have to be bold. I know it's difficult, but the young people have to be bold, and they have to confront racism. They have to talk about it. Wherever they see it and its manifestations. And in the private sector, I know that it's very covert in nature. So you have to educate yourself about all the manifestations of racism. Sometimes it manifests itself by just condescending behavior, where your colleague will say, oh, you speak so well. Where do you come from? Where did you go to school? I mean, that's so condescending and making you an exception among other Black people. So these are the forms that you have to be very alive to, because these days the forms are really covert. Now, about what happened at Stellenbosch University, I don't know, because I'm not in this field anymore. Maybe Professor Mandlingozi can weigh in on this. What remedies do we have to address? We have remedies to address racism, but what do we have? What do we do about tribalism? Well, if you look at our constitution, it mentions many grounds for non-discrimination, including ethnic origin and so on. So the Constitution mentions this, and we also have a commission for the protection and promotion of linguistic, religious communities that have to look at these issues. I want to make a very controversial statement about tribalism. At the commission where I serve, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, states are always asked to present statistics on ethnicity. And I always say that in our country, we don't collect those statistics precisely because apartheid tried to divide us according to ethnic groups. So from where I'm sitting, and really, you can't criticize me because you know, if you don't agree with me. I don't think in South Africa tribalism is as big a problem like in countries like Kenya, where even elections are tribal based. So that's my answer to that. But the Constitution also can be used to deal with tribalism. I am unable. I'm trying to read these questions as I go, but I'm hoping that some of these questions will be answered by other panelists as the webinar continues. There's one question that says, please tell me why racism allowed God made people, but Satan is using racism to divide and conquer. While we are fighting each other based on color, the cabal governments are busy annihilating all of us. By 2030, they want to dominate 7 billion people. Religion is very difficult for me, and it's one area that I try to stay clear of, especially these days where the churches talk about the God of Israel. That's now on a lighter note. There are a lot of racial complaints that are continually being raised by Black people in different platforms. Those are the people residing in the white-owned farm. They are being abused in all forms of abuse by white people. The biggest question is how and when will they get assistance from anti-racist organization that we are discussing here. I think the South African Human Rights Commission has a big role to play, and also the Department of Labor, somebody to look at the conditions of service of employment in the farms, and whether the basic income salary is paid to those people. So I've tried really to just pick on some of these questions, but I'm hoping that, as I said, the panelists will pick up on some of these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the input. Indeed, it looks like there's a lot of meat there for the panelists to engage with. And we thank you very much for your time. We know how busy you are. It's important for us that you made the time to come and join the National School of Government and the DOJ in this important webinar. We will be happy if you stay on for a little while, but we also do understand that you will disappear and leave us at some point, but we are grateful for your participation. Thank you. We will now move to the second part of our program, which is the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Advocate Shireen Said, the DDG Constitutional Development at the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. You've met her already. She delivered the opening address on behalf of her DG, Advocate Mashabane, who couldn't make it. I would now hand over to you, Advocate Said, to continue with the panel discussion, the next part of our program. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaunda. And thank you, Advocate Tlakula. That was quite insightful. And it's so important every year as we commemorate Human Rights Month to take us to the history, because without our history, which always informs how we take the next chapters forward, we forget where we come from, and the idea is that we are reminded so that we challenge and insist and protect with everything that we have our democracy. So I'm also very excited by the questions that are coming through. We certainly will record them in the hope that we get through all of them, but if we don't, we'll pick them up and respond to them in different ways. So as much as some of them have been answered, as our keynote speakers indicated, we'll try and pick them up during this discussion. It gives us a sense of what some of the real challenges are, even though we have the academic, the systemic, and we hear in terms of service delivery, the kinds of challenges people experience, but it is also good to have the scenarios that are pointed out in the questions. Now, without further ado, and we do want to have lots of opportunity to engage with the questions and have a discussion, I'm going to get straight into the panel discussion. We really don't have as much time as we ordinarily would like. It is a webinar, so each of the panelists have no more than 10 minutes, and I am unfortunately going to time you. So please bear with us. And if there's time later on, which I will come back to you to give you at least 2 minutes to wrap up after the question and answer session, in case you've forgotten or didn't get a chance to make certain comments during your inputs. Now, we're going to break with protocol a little bit, with absolute respect to our speakers, especially coming up after, and with no disrespect to the current speaker who I'm going to introduce, for the simple reason that his schedule didn't allow from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights based in Southern Africa here in Pretoria, but covering the region of Southern Africa, because they are having a process, internal process that they couldn't be excused from. It's a global one. And so they made a request, which our other panelists have very kindly agreed to be allowed to speak first. So I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Francis Igirugi. I hope I pronounced that properly. I hope I haven't butchered your name. Francis is a human rights lawyer called to the Nigerian bar in 2004. He obtained his academic qualifications from Harvard, London, Nigerian Law School, and Imo State University. He also studied human rights in the University of Gothenburg and the University of Tromsø, that is in Sweden and Norway, respectively. He has worked with different national and international human rights NGOs in various capacities in Nigeria, Sweden, and the UK. He's also worked for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Liberia office as Human Rights Officer, and he is currently the Anti-Racial Discrimination Advisor for OHCHR based here in Southern Africa. So Francis, over to you.
Yeah, good morning. Are you hearing me?
Very well, thank you. And we see you.
All right. So thank you a lot, the program director and the moderator. And thanks to fellow panelists for accommodating us because of our schedule. Please kindly permit me to stand on the already established protocol, and special regard to the keynote speaker, our own advocate, Lakula, for sharing her enormous wealth of experience. Really appreciate that. So my topic I'll be looking at briefly is global best practices or strategies for tackling racism and inequality in any society. We will talk about global best practices and strategies. Of course, the drivers are the public sector. So we see it from that perspective. By word of introduction, I'll just make 3 comments regarding this. So when we talk about combating racism and racial discrimination, essentially it requires concerted efforts and the collective commitment of everybody, all of us, government, CSOs, communities worldwide, in order to see that this is done. Again, no state or country is perfect or free from this scourge. And the third point is the task of combating racism and racial discrimination is a work in progress. In other words, no country has perfected their system that is free of this. So we are all struggling to see that we conquer this scourge. So what I would do, I will look at 9 global best practices and strategies. I'll just, because of time factor, I'll just briefly talk about them, each of the point. So the first global best practice that I need to add that this is not exhaustive. The 9 global best practices that I'll be highlighting is not exhaustive. So just for us, just to guide us for the present discussion. So the first best practice is legislation and policy frameworks. Here, many countries have their anti-discrimination laws and policies that explicitly prohibit racism and racial discrimination. And this is a basis for holding individuals and institutions accountable for discriminatory practices and promoting equality under the law. Yeah, in the case of South Africa, of course, we are aware that South Africa has legal frameworks and policies that combat racism and racial discrimination. We will see the PEPUDA, the Famous Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, the robust constitutional provisions that prohibit such discrimination, and also the NAP, which have been talked about. So it's important to point out that having legislation and policy frameworks is not enough. What is important here is for the structure to be properly funded and for effective implementation of this legal framework and policy, because if they're not implemented, at the end of it, will not make any sense. So the second global best practice is diversity and inclusion initiatives. So organizations and institutions across sectors have implemented diversity and inclusion initiatives to create welcoming environment for individuals from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. Of course, this initiative normally are used in recruitment practices, training programs, and resource allocation, and that to support underrepresented groups. In the case of South Africa, of course, we are aware a lot of legislations and also policies that ensure diversity and inclusion. You have the Employment Equity Act, which aims to promote equity in the workplace, the broad-based Black economic empowerment, and affirmative action policies. These are what South Africa used to say that it actually go to this objective. Then the third global best practice is the education and awareness campaigns. Raising awareness about the impact of racism and promoting cultural sensitivity through education initiatives have proven effective in combating prejudice and discrimination. And in this instance, schools, universities, and community organizations can help to play a key role in fostering understanding and empathy among individuals. Because without awareness and education, people will not know what is going on, and they will not appreciate the effect of this scourge. So the fourth one is community empowerment. Empowering communities affected by racism by providing them with resources, support, and opportunities for self-advocacy is essential for fostering resilience and promoting social change. And here, community-led initiatives can address specific needs and challenges faced by marginalized groups. And here, it's important that members of marginalized communities should always participate in policy formulation affecting them. In other words, there is need for consultation in such policies that will affect members of such communities that are affected by racism or racial discrimination, so that they will be partakers and also contribute in any policy that affect them. We don't just sit and make policy and then impose it on them. That is not MARAIT compliant. Then the fifth is data-driven decision-making. Advocate Lakula, I think she made mention of that issue of data, because it utilizing data to identify patterns of discrimination, measure progress that inform policy decisions is crucial for combating racism effectively. Collecting disaggregated data on race and ethnicity can highlight disparities and guide interventions aimed at promoting equity. In fact, in the last third concluding observation on South Africa, just last December, paragraph 9A of the concluding observation pointed to this. It requested for South Africa to provide disaggregated statistics for the measurement of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. That is to say, without data, one will not be able to know who are being affected in terms of the number of persons, the sex as disaggregated. Then the sixth global best practice is intersectoral collaboration in terms of partnership. Collaboration across sectors, including government, civil society, academia, and private sector, can leverage diverse perspectives and resources to address racism holistically. Partnership and network can simplify the impact of initiatives and facilitate knowledge sharing. So it's really important for the public sector, the government, and civil society to work hand in hand jointly, because with such concerted effort, we will make more progress than when each agency is trying to do it alone. Then the seventh global best practice, promotion of intercultural dialogue. This is important because encouraging intercultural dialogue, mutual respect, and positive interactions among individuals from different racial backgrounds can help break down stereotypes and foster social cohesion. Again, in this instance, cultural exchange programs, dialogues, and community events can promote understanding and solidarity. I understand that South Africa has implemented several social cohesion programs, so they need to work on its success with proper funding, and also to discover the shortcomings and work on them. Then the eighth is the issue of accountability and transparency. Holding institutions accountable for addressing racism and inequality is key to driving meaningful change. The public sector can promote transparency, monitor progress, and ensure that resources are allocated equitably to support initiatives aimed at promoting social justice. This is important because if there is no consequence for institutional misbehavior, of course, such behavior will continue unabated. This is not what we want. Then the last but not the least is reporting to United Nations human rights bodies. By this, I mean reporting to treaty bodies, to universal periodical review, and special procedures, that is special rapporteurs, independent experts. By submitting regular reports to UN human rights bodies, states can track progress, identify challenges, and assess the impact of policies and actions on human rights, including on racial discrimination. Again, reporting to UN human rights bodies hold government accountable for their human rights commitments and obligations under international human rights treaties and conventions. Then in conclusion—
That's your timer. 1 minute conclusion.
Yeah, in conclusion, so by adopting this strategy and lessons, the public sector can play a vital role in driving development that is inclusive, equitable, and free from racism and inequality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really good timing. You were just a few seconds over. Francis, I know you have to leave, but I was wondering if you could take one or two questions before you go, and then we will excuse you. Would that be all right?
Okay, yeah, that'd be okay.
All right, let's maybe if you could just go to the chat box, the Q&A, and if there's anything there that relates to you, whilst everyone tries to upload their questions, please feel free to pick on one. Let me help you there. I don't see any particular questions coming through, but I don't know if you had a chance to look at them previously. There's one question that says, why are we having, who are we having the conversation with? If we're having a conversation of racism as victims only and not with perpetrators, will it be acknowledged? And further, every act of racism should be prosecuted or harshly judged. Maybe we'll just take that question. Any thoughts on that?
Sorry, can you come again with that question?
Yeah, I'm actually going to the questions on the Q&A, where David Mashlawani says, my question is, who are we having the conversation with? If we're having a conversation of racism as victims only and not with perpetrators, will it be acknowledged? And then his other point is every act of racism should be prosecuted and harshly judged. And of course, he thanked Advocate Tlakula earlier.
Yeah, I will say in terms of conversation, I think all the parties should be on the table as far as we are discussing the issue of racism and racial discrimination, because sometimes the challenge is some people don't even understand the impact of this, and some don't even understand the meaning when we talk about racism and all that. So in terms of like what I talk about, issue of education and awareness, so everybody needs to be enlightened on this. So if you are talking about it, both the victims and the perpetrators should be on the table. But that does not preclude the state from prosecuting anybody that is supposed to be prosecuted, because anyone that commits crime should pay for it. So in effect, everybody should be on the table. Nobody should be excluded.
Thank you very much. And Francis, thank you so much for your inputs and for making the time today to speak with us. And we look forward to engaging with you a bit more. But as we'd agreed, we're happy to excuse you from this webinar. So if you can stay a few minutes longer, that's up to you, but you're excused. You're welcome.
Thank you, and I thank Philip panelists for accommodating us. Thank you very much. I will join later if I finish on time. Thank you.
You would be very welcome. Thank you. So now over to the rest of the program, and I have the privilege now to introduce our next speaker to discuss fostering transformation, equality, and diversity in the public sector, countering racism and discrimination in service delivery. And I have the privilege now of introducing our DG for Public Service and Administration. So Ms. Yuliswa Makasi is an activist bureaucrat who started a career in the public sector in 1996. She's obviously the DG in the department since March 2020, and her responsibilities include ensuring that there's effective and efficient administration of the department, amongst many other aspects. She was head of the Department for Community Safety in the Gauteng Provincial Government. She is a qualified coach, strategist, communicator, and an activist who has grown up in different ranks in the public service. Her academic credentials are a master's in philosophy in coaching management from the University of Stellenbosch, a master's degree in public policy and management from the University of Manchester in the UK, and a Bachelor of Arts degree from Vista University in Pretoria. She is continuously improving her skills and obtained a number of certificates, mainly from Wits University and the Gordon Business School, on project management, leadership, financial management, and government communications, etc. She's worked in various different roles in the public service, and from operations, politics, strategy level, and has been exposed to various levels of decision-making, oversight, management, and operations. So over to you, DG. You have 10 minutes, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, facilitator. I am unable to show my face because I am blocked. It says Zoom is unable to detect camera. I don't know if it's my fault, this side, or what's going on. But for the interest of time, I think you can allow me to continue even if you can't see me. Apologies for that. My name is Yoli Swamakas. As introduced, I am the DG for the Department of Public Service and Administration, and I want to rise on all protocols that have already been established. And I do want to thank you for inviting us to participate in the activities of the Anti-Racism Week, including this webinar. We understand that this is an annual week aimed at at raising awareness on issues of racism and discrimination in the country. And whilst preparing for this presentation, it really took me back to my journey as a young Black woman in the South African public sector who has grown through, well, I'm not so young now as I was young before, but I started when I was young. Who has grown through different roles and responsibilities and through different ranks and the experiences that come through with those different roles. Certainly, racism has been part of those experiences. Certainly, sexism has been part of those experiences, and patriarchy generally in the workplace. And also ageism has been part of those experiences that, and of course, being a female and young has presented a lot of opportunities for me personally in our democracy. And I'm happy that I think I've been able to, through support and mentoring and, generally a conducive environment, I have been able to work my way around those particular experiences and where I am today. And I wanted to just acknowledge this Pansy. I don't know if she's still here, but I think that we don't honor enough people who have done so much for us as the younger generation, not the young, but younger generation, to them in terms of opening up the ways for us. I still remember Sis Pansy when we were preparing for the conference in Durban in 2001. She was leading and we were in the youth sector, and we really looked up to them in terms of guidance and issues that we needed to engage with in terms of the conference. So I do really want to acknowledge Sis Pansy, because I don't think we do enough to acknowledge those people who have helped us to be where we are today. Having said that, Chairperson, at the heart of racism is an institutionalized form of segregation, which I think we know, which has a number of objectives, mainly to systematically advantage one population group and simultaneously disadvantage others. In the South African case, this translated into white supremacy and Black denialism in respect to our case in South Africa. Black denialism of all forms of human rights. Legally, this was founded on the Apartheid Group Act. This apartheid law did not simply determine where people should live or not in cases of Black people, but also determine that white people could access universal rights wherever they chose, whilst limiting mobility and accessibility of political and socio-economic rights. All these were run by an apartheid bureaucracy which was designed and performed to enforce and reinforce the segregation system. In the process, building an unjust values and white supremacy and unjust values of white supremacy and Black inferiority in all aspects of life, socially, economically, and politically. Unfortunately, we still have remnants of the apartheid bureaucracy in the public service, and therefore issues of racism are still a challenge, even though not often spoken about. I think that racism in the public service is quite overt. Indeed, we need to strengthen our interventions aimed at fighting racism and its other relatives, which I've reflected on earlier on: sexism, tribalism. I agree with Sis Pansy that tribalism is not a big issue at a macro level in government or in South Africa in general, but it is real in certain spaces. I have learned, in national government, for instance, I have learned and found out that there are groups of certain people who think that they must control certain parts of departments in terms of certain national groups and etc., or certain tribal groups and etc. So those are things that and if you don't come from that space of that tribal group, you may struggle to work with those particular groups of people. Of course, the issue of ageism is an issue that is used as a discriminatory practice in the public service, and sometimes in very easy, in a language that you may think it's a joke. I heard somebody one day saying, because we bring in young people in the department where I work, and I heard somebody saying the crash of DG, the crash of DG in the department. And for me, that's a big issue in terms of ageism, and I was able to call it in order at the time it happens. I was fortunate that it happened in my presence. We also have new forms of racism that do not necessarily come with the old bureaucracy necessarily, with the old white bureaucracy necessarily. These are things like colorism and otherism that we experience in the public service that manifest in different ways. And our transformation agenda since democracy has done a number of things. And I'm not going to run a list of those things, the laws that have been changed. I think the speaker before me has touched on the laws, but I do want to acknowledge broadly that there's a number of laws that have been changed that have enabled a number of us to be in the public service today and occupy senior roles or strategic roles in the public service that aims to unlock and ensure delivery of services to people. So lots of those repealing of those apartheid legislation as well. One of them, for an example, is the Group Areas Act, which has enabled public servants to be able to deliver services to all citizens, not along racial colors, but acknowledging the fact that the Constitution regards all of us as equal in the country. Also extend the reach of public administration to cover all sectors and geographical spaces of society, to build the ethos, ethics, and integrity of public administration institutions that places the interests and well-being of citizens ahead of anything else. This has been encapsulated into the Batupile principles. I have only 10 minutes, Chair. I will not go in detail into the Batupile principles, but I do know that most of the people who are logged here know about Batupile because they are public servants. Thirdly, consciously building the professional character and values of the democratic public administration. We have said a lot about professionalization in the past 2 years of the public service. There is so much work that has been done, including the adoption of the professionalization framework by Cabinet and some of the reforms that we are doing in the public service. The last issue I want to highlight here relates to inclusion of women in decision-making. When I look at statistics before 1994, we were at 0% of women in senior management positions in the public service. And today we are almost at 50%. There is a time in our democracy where we did reach 50 to 55%, but we have dropped, unfortunately. We are just below 50% currently. This is a result of direct interventions by government through relevant prescripts that have been mentioned. Some have been mentioned earlier. The transformative role of the public administration in dismantling revolves around really the constitutional values and principles for public administration as encompassed in our Constitution. We must have ability to deliver services to all citizens, democratizing the administrative legislation to yield functional fairness for the recipients of state service delivery. We must build a bureaucratic diversity that represents all South Africa's population democracy. And progressively, we must build a bureaucratic professionalism in terms of functionality and delivery of the bureaucracy. We must manifest strong ethos of efficacy, efficiency, and responsiveness to build the visibility of the gains of democracy through our transformation of the public service. I want to highlight, Chair, towards my conclusion, that some of the interventions, such as the training by the NSG that it's doing on anti-racism, is issues that we must take seriously as public servants and support, because we can only learn to do things differently, and such interventions we must appreciate. And lastly, as I conclude, I want to offer that perhaps in further building on this work that is being done, we need to consider using affirmative action to address wealth inequality and opportunity gap. What I noticed at DPSA was that we were struggling with reaching the 50% target of women in the SMS. And one of the things that we had to do in order to intervene was to go back to the affirmative action policy and actually introduce it formally in the department and be able to say that if there is a difference of 5 points between the candidates and there's a woman who is a number 2, we should be able to consider that woman because of the affirmative action principles that we are introducing. I think we should also introduce blind test examinations in order to support our recruitment and to diminish the bias in recruitment, as well as in school. If you think about grading of students and in the civil service in general, I find blind tests to also have a critical role to play. We must consider rolling out awareness using this week in particular on issues of racism. I would like us as DPSA to really issue a circular, to partner with a DOJ and issue a circular to all departments to make sure that there are activities that they do in order to also embrace the work of promoting awareness on racism. Ensure there is a regular process to obtain data on employee engagement, certification, and issues around transformation within the public service, and create an inclusion program that assists all employees to feel that they belong in the public service and that they are able then to deliver quality services to people that we have to serve, which is those who live in South Africa. And for those who are experiencing racism, I think it's important in the public service. It's important to use the established labor relations processes in the public service so that those cases are cases that can be dealt with. And sometimes, as Spencer said earlier on, these show themselves in different ways. It may not be overt racism, but it may be covert. Even in such case, we need to be able to pick up those issues and process them through our system. And we do need to work together to free the public service from racism and other discriminatory practices. And I do thank you, Chairperson, for this invitation for the DPSA to come and be part of this panel. I apologize, Chair. I hope my team has indicated to you I was supposed to exit at 11 for another meeting, but I did indicate that I will stay maybe until 11:15. They must delay my meeting a little bit. I will stay until 11:15 just to listen to other speakers. And if there's any questions I need to entertain, perhaps I could do so. Thank you a lot, Facilitator.
Thank you very much. And yes, I think you've raised incredibly important issues and also given us a bit of a program of action for not just the next year, which will include in our 30 years of constitutional democracy, but also what we might consider in benchmarking where we are today and for what we'll do for the next anti-racism week. Not to say that there wouldn't be other activities we'd want to continue on for the rest of this year. Your team definitely, DG, has indicated that you have to leave by 11:15. So we're very grateful that you could rearrange your schedule to stay with us. And I'm just wondering if you mind, I would just look at one of the questions that you might want to pick up whilst you're here, and the rest we can pick out, respond to later on. So there's a question from Holofelo Maseko. Why is it that there's racism in service delivery? Government trying to mitigate racism, but still not looking after its own people. Areas where there are, reading this now, so areas where there is Black people dominated does not receive the same service delivery as in the suburbs. What is the corrective action of government to deal with these matters? So if I could pose that question to you and answer as much as you can, and whatever else we can pick up later on, given your time constraints. Over to you, DG.
Thank
You're
you.
unmuted.
Yes, thank you, facilitator. I think this question has to do with historical spatial issues in respect to allocation in terms of service delivery, and I do want to say that from our part as the public service, we expect public servants to serve people with respect across the system. So those values of respect, those values that are encompassed in the Batupile principles, quality services on time and etc. So that's what the expectation is in terms of service delivery. But I do suppose that due to infrastructure as well, it may be easier to serve certain areas in terms of service compared to other areas. So we have to continuously look at how we build and improve on our structure, on our infrastructure in respect to those underserviced areas or poorly serviced areas. I think I'll just leave it at that without racializing the question itself, facilitator.
Thank you very much. And I was just going to respond before you left in that you've raised two other very
when you gave your inputs, mainly that it is very, very important that people, especially in the public service, do raise their issues through the mechanisms that we have, including labor relations. But what your point also relates to is the fact that sometimes we don't necessarily understand that we are being discriminated against, and we don't quite know how to use it within the labor relations code. And that's where your point is. We really need to do a whole lot more of awareness so that we understand that this is behavior based on race discrimination, or actually any other type of discrimination. This is what it looks like. We sense it usually, but we don't necessarily know how to then defend and protect it. So I think there's a lot more need for awareness. And I think your point and the other speakers' points are, we've really done well in terms of having the legislative framework and the policy frameworks, but now it's really now building that culture to go forward. So any closing comments before you want to go, DG, or might we stop at that?
I am happy to stop at that. Thank you very
Okay.
much. I'm happy to stop at that. I know you have time constraints. Thank you.
Thank you very much, DG. And of course, we excuse you from the rest of the program. We appreciate you taking the time to come in and spend the morning with us. Over now to our next speaker. And I've just gotten disheveled as I look for, oh, sorry, I just had a little bit of a mishap here. So our next speaker is Professor Mandla Stanley Makhanya. Professor Makhanya served as the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa. Prior to that, he was the Vice Chancellor at the same university. He's a prominent proponent of higher education leadership and advocacy. He's a past president of the International Council for Distance Education. He served 2 terms as a treasurer of the African Council for Distance Education, and he's now their Goodwill Ambassador. Professor Makhanya has also served as president of the Higher Education Teaching and Learning Association in the US, which is an international body for higher education professionals. As such, he has a thorough knowledge of higher education trends in both the developing and development higher education contexts. It's a very long CV, so I'm going to summarize without disrespecting all of your experience, Professor. Prof has a PhD from the University of Pretoria, a master's degree in industrial sociology from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, a BA honors in sociology from the University of Fort Hare, as well as a BA degree from that same university, and a postgraduate diploma in tertiary education from UNISA, and an advanced management program from Harvard University. So Prof, over to you, and you have 10 minutes.
No, thank you very much, Program Director and the moderator of our session. I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize that we'll be introduced in this kind of manner. I would have excused myself for that. But Program Director, ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker, Advocate Tlakula, and our fellow panelists, I just want to say that it's an honor and privilege, for me to address you today on the topic that has actually been allocated to me, because we know that this racism is affecting our society in a deeper kind of fashion, 30 years into our democracy. When all of us made our mark, as we will all recall, during the very first democratic election, we made a conscious decision at that stage to move forward and to heal ourselves of the inequalities of the past. We committed ourselves to treat each other with respect and observe the inherent right to dignity. It's therefore quite disconcerting, that our country has regressed, since that watershed moment of 1994, with the general increase in racist and xenophobic discourse, as we've heard from the keynote speaker and the speakers, who've just spoken before me. Now, I just want to make reference, to the insurrection in July 2021 in KwaZulu-Natal, which was, as some would prefer to suggest, a spontaneous uprising by the economically disadvantaged and underclass. One cannot ignore the growing level of disenfranchisement and deprivation in our society that has led to polarization among the members of our society. In fact, the brutal fight for scarce resources and the lack of access to social capital have fomented a racist and xenophobic discourse, and this displayed itself during that unrest. Now, let me just talk briefly about racism, knowing fully well that we are all well-versed in this subject. The definition in the dictionary says something that I just want to make reference to just briefly. It says it's prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism that is directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's race is superior. So that's a very important part because it goes to the heart of what we've been hearing, since we started this morning. But I prefer then, to take the definition that was offered by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which defines racism as engaging in a cause of vexatious comment or conduct that is known or ought to reasonably be known to be unwelcome. So which means that the manner in which you do it is a conscious move, knowing fully well that you are not supposed to be actually venturing into that space. So I'm preferring this definition because it is easy to identify overt racism, but it's a lot more difficult to pin down and prove what I'll refer to as subliminal racist conduct or utterances. In fact, it's becoming more and more apparent, and many people are falling prey to such subliminal discourse, and even perpetrators themselves, you will find a situation that at times they tend to be oblivious to the kind of harm that is occasioned to the victim. So racism can take on various forms, and word or sentence which constitute racism for one does not necessarily constitute that for another. But the courts have taken a very dim view on occasions and accusations of racism without just cause. You'll recall in the case of the South African Chemical Workers Union and another, against Chlorchem, and others, where the court remarked in a following manner, I just want to quote it. It says, to accuse a person of being racist or to say a person that he is displaying a racist attitude is racially offensive. I'm equally satisfied that these words, objectively viewed, can be regarded as insulting and abusive. It's difficult to imagine under what circumstances an employee who without just cause or a reasonable basis, therefore, and accordingly, unjustifiably accuses another employee of being a racist, that he or she was displaying a racist attitude, will easily escape dismissal, unquote. So our Constitution, in its preamble, outlines the fundamental values on which government should build a transformed public service. Our DG has made reference to this, as she was making a presentation. On these values, we are talking, amongst others, about human dignity, the achievement of equality and advancement of human rights and freedoms, non-racialism and non-sexism, supremacy of the Constitution, and the rule of law. Now, relating these foundational values to the public administration and public service means that every public servant must be cognizant that they display morality and humanity towards fellow public servants, towards stakeholders, and most importantly, towards the citizens that they serve. This must happen against the background of respecting, of protecting, and of promoting and fulfilling the rights that are enshrined in our Bill of Rights in Section 7, subsection 2 of our Constitution. So the public service has the benefit of a value system that is prescriptive in our Section 195. These values are playing an important role in respect of the conduct of everyone in the public administration and the public service. So in our context, these values and principles must determine how public servants and public officials serve the interests and welfare of society and citizens. I mean, you need to note here that I'm making reference to society and citizens without categorizing them, because the manner in which we need to look at society is to use the lens of them as human beings rather than the categories that you'll find at display. So our constitutional values and principles that are covered in Section 195 are stipulating clearly that public service must display a high standard of professional ethics, that they must be efficient in terms of the use of resources, must be development-oriented, must be impartial in the provision of services, and responsive to the needs of people. Now, these parts are so important because when you talk about professional ethics, it's obviously taking into account the fact that you come being imbued with these professional ethics in the manner in which you conduct yourself, in the manner in which you communicate, in the manner you do virtually everything else. That the efficient use of resources is taking into account the fact that you don't just jump into using resources, but you make clear-cut calculations on a rational basis that if it was my resources, would have I gone in the right kind of direction in this fashion? So you don't just do it simply because it's the resources of the state, because remember that we are supposed to be the stewards of these resources, and you do this part of work in an impartial manner. So these are kinds of things that are fairly critical, because in many instances, you find that we fall short of that kind of expectation, which partly explains why then, citizens tend to complain about the manner in which we conduct ourselves. So part of the problem I want to argue is that the public service is characterized by institutional fundamentalism, where governance frameworks, institutional policies and procedures become the key measures of performance, instead of improving on our capabilities and progressively realizing the rights in the Bill of Rights. So, which means that we go in a regressive fashion on the side that is not supposed to be the driver of where we're supposed to be. So it then follows this mechanistic compliance and regulatory approach to public administration, so much so that the intent of constitutional values and principles and aspirations of our Constitution are then misdirected and are relegated to posters on office walls. You walk into any office, they are displayed, but the manner in which we conduct ourselves is completely contrary to what is displayed on those particular boards. So which means then that these principles, such as the high standard of professional ethics, accountability, and provision of services in an equitable manner without bias, are reduced to institutional issues like the disclosure of conflict of interest, the appointment of ethics officer or ethics officers, and the management of sexual harassment and discrimination in the workplace. Such issues are removed from the lived experience of citizens of how public servants conduct themselves when interacting with them. Often the decorum and the ethos befitting the public servant or the public official that ought to display ambassadorship to the fundamental rights, values, and principles in the Constitution is in short supply. So the relationship of our CVPs, or constitutional values and principles and fundamental rights and values of our constitution, often go unnoticed, but the synergy is evident. For example, the right of access to information is linked to the principle of transparency. The fundamental rights of the right to dignity and right to equality are linked to the principle of a high standard of professional ethics and principle of provision of resources impartially, fairly, and equitably, and without bias. So these foundational values of the rule of law and right to just administrative action is linked to the principle of accountability. So good governance means governing with people rather than ruling over people. So in our own context, good governance is simply articulating and adhering to the constitutional values and principles. But governance outcomes are not automatically achieved. So a precondition for this achievement, for me, is the internalization and actualization of the values and principles. They need to guide our actions, all of us, all the time, throughout the governance system. In other words, they must be embedded in a culture of values. This in turn requires, in my case, the kind of leadership that is able to promote the spirit, purport, and objects of the Constitution. Each one of us in the public service, public administration, and anyone performing a public function has a duty and an obligation to ensure that the Bill of Rights are respected, that they are promoted, that they are protected, and that they are fulfilled. Just with these few words, moderator and program director, I just want to thank you.
Thank you. That was perfect timing. You concluded just as the buzzer went. We appreciate your comments. I'm going to be, in the interest of time, thank you for your inputs, and let's wait for questions and answers a little later and move straight ahead to the next item on the agenda, which is Professor Madlingozi speaking about instilling the values of human dignity, equality, and anti-racism in the public service as an agent of transformation. Now, please allow me to introduce Professor Madlingozi, who, may I say, congratulations. He's recently been appointed as commissioner at the South African Human Rights Commission. At the commission, his focal areas are anti-racism, justice, and education. Professor Madlingozi has sat on various boards of civil society organizations, including the Rural Democracy Trust, Mining Affected Communities United in Action, Women Affected by Mining Action, the Institute for Social Dialogue, the Socioeconomic Rights Institution, the Center for Human Rights, the Imbiza, which is the Journal of African Writing, the Zimbabwe Exiles Forum, the Africa Ikalafe Pluriversity, is also a member of the Steering Committee on the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability. He's also served for many years on the Kulumani Support Group and was recently appointed sorry, I said that already. Recently appointed to the Commission of Inquiry that looked at racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination in advertising for the South African Human Rights Commission. He's a visiting professor at the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University in Rotterdam and a faculty member of the Vienna Master of Arts in Applied Human Rights program. He is co-editor of the South African Journal of Human Rights. He is co-editor as well of Symbol or Substance, which deals with socioeconomic rights in South Africa, and a co-editor of the Introduction to Law and Legal Skills in South Africa. So over to you, Professor Madlingozi, and 10 minutes is yours. When you hear the buzzer going, please round up.
Good morning, Advocate Shireen Said. Good morning, fellow panelists. It's good to see Professor Makaya once again. I must also thank the Department of Justice for inviting us as a Human Rights Commission. I hope you can hear me well. I'm struggling with sinus. Program Director, if you give me 10 minutes, I speak for 6 minutes. If you give me 30 minutes, I speak for 50 minutes. I'll speak for only 6 minutes. I think, our keynote speaker, Honorable Advocate Tlakula, has said everything that needs to be said. What I want to do is to just distill 4 lessons that we want to share with the public service Commission on Public Servants this morning. So of course, as you know, the South African Human Rights Commission is a Chapter 9 institution created by the Constitution with a mandate to protect, promote, and monitor human rights, but also to instill a culture of human rights. Some of the tools that we use include educational activities. We also carry out investigations either in our own name or pursuant to a complaint. Thirdly, we institute hearings as well as inquiries. It is these hearings and inquiries that allow us to carry out a systematic or systemic analysis of the root cause of problems, just like racism. So you will recall, as different panelists have said, we had a national hearing, inquiry into racism into the media. We also 2 years ago instituted a hearing on the July 2021 unrest, where we found that some of the attacks that happened in KwaZulu-Natal, in Phoenix, had to do with anti-Black racism, but also that they were embedded in a long history of racism in that community. We also a year ago had a provincial inquiry, which became national inquiry into racism into advertising, where we're looking at how the advertising industry actually perpetuates racial stereotypes, and also that the untransformed nature of the industry is responsible for racism. So I'm mentioning these hearings and inquiries because in these few minutes that I have, I want to share 4 lessons that public servants can take into account as they seek to tackle anti-racism. Because of course, while global best practices are important, we need to be mindful of the fact that South Africa is quite unique. Unique in a sense that in South Africa, we are dealing with a historically racist country. So not a country that deals with incidents of racism, but a country that, because it's a settler colony, it's a historically racist country, and that racism is embedded in the fabric of society. So 4 key lessons that we have learned from this systematic inquiries and hearings that we have had on racism for a number of years. The first one, colleagues, is a controversial one, which is that racism is but a symptom. Racism is not the root cause of the problem, but is a symptom. So while we know that racism is interconnected to other social ills and leads to other human rights violations like equality, dignity, and the denial of socioeconomic rights, but at the root cause of the problem, there's a need for us to understand that racism is a symptom, and that the root cause of the problem is the unfinished business of colonialism. This is what we see in our hearings and in our inquiries, both at the national level and at the provincial level. That, of course, as we all know, in 1994, we had a transition to democracy, a transition that was a negotiated settlement, not an anti-colonial triumph, and that the understanding was that a developmental state staffed with capable, capacitated, transformed, ethical public servant will continue the business of dismantling colonialism. So colonialism is a condition of possibility for ongoing institutionalized racism. And by colonialism, I mean it as manifested in 4 things. 1, land dispossession. We can never dismantle racism, colleagues, unless we deal with this fundamental issue of land dispossession and this settler-native relations that continue, where one is still the dispossessed and the other one is the dispossessor. That emboldens racists to continue what they're doing. So land dispossession. Second manifestation of colonialism is, of course, economic subjugation, where economic impoverishment leads to people being victimized, marginalized, and dehumanized. So economic subjugation and the need for programs that are targeted at redistributing the economy become important. Once again, colleagues, I'm talking about systemic institutionalized racism, not just incidences of discrimination or individualized acts of people calling each other by a certain name. That's what we should be seized with. The third one, of course, cultural and knowledge subjugation. Black people in South Africa are a numerical majority, but in many ways, a cultural minority, which leads to feelings of inferiority and so forth. So need to attend to that as a manifestation of colonialism. And then the last one, of course, white supremacy. White supremacy. There is no dismantling of racism unless we understand that the root of racism are issues of, on the one hand, white supremacy, and on the other hand, internalized notions of racism. So as public servant, are we aware of our internalized nature of racism? And are we aware of issues of white supremacy, that when I go to a public office, the way that the public servant engages with me as a black person is different to the way they engage with the white person. So colonialism is a condition of possibility of racism. And one of the key lessons that we see from our hearings and our inquiries is the need for public servants to have a consciousness of the unfinished business of colonialism. The second one, of course, is the need to be anti-racist. So while our constitution implores us to work towards a non-racist society, there is no dismantling racism unless in our approach, in our attitudes, in our strategies, in our program, we deliberately and unapologetically adopt an anti-racist posture. Not a non-racist posture, but an anti-racist posture. And that means two things, colleagues. Number one, it means deliberately coming up with programs and projects that are targeted at dismantling the totality of the white power structure, as Steve Biko would call it. For example, how do we deal with the issue of spatial injustice? Not just issues of electrifying, informal settlements, but how do we dismantle spatial injustice? Because that's also at the root of some of the racist, institutionalized racist problems that we have. So a deliberate anti-racist posture, not a non-racist one. On the other hand, anti-racism means that as public servants and as a public service, we are mindful about the ways we perpetuate racism ourselves. Last week, I was in Eastern Cape, where we worked with scholars who didn't have transport, with no scholar transport. And the walk took us an hour and a half. An hour and a half, those kids have to make a journey to school. That is a problem of colonialism. The failure to ensure scholar transport, the failure to build schools, corruption and maladministration perpetuate racism by public service. So anti-racist means also a consciousness of understanding the way we, in ourselves, we are complicit in perpetuating institutionalized racism. To the failure to eradicate pit latrines, for example. The third lesson, quickly, Program Director, is the need to be intersectional. Some of the issues that we see, in our hearings and in our inquiries is public service that operates in silos. So the need, as we all know, for intergovernmental but cross-sectoral, intersectoral collaboration between departments. But on the other hand, intersectionality means the need to understand that issues such as gender-based violence. For example, a woman who suffers from obstetric violence, dying while giving birth, or being abused while giving birth. That is not only an issue of gender. It has to do with class, it has to do with locality, it has to do with sexuality, it has to do with races, that because she's a Black, poor, township-based woman, is a victim of this. So the need to understand racism in instances that when they present themselves do not look like racist. So an intersectional consciousness.
Professor
Lastly,
Madlingozi, may I ask you to
Yeah.
round up, please? Thank you. Sorry.
yes. So lastly, the issue of the problem of racism as an issue of the unresolved national question. That in South Africa, we've not built a nation, and if we need to build a nation, we need to be conscious of the need to create a nation based on social justice, but that social justice is only possible through reparations, redistribution, and restitution. You cannot solve the issue of institutionalized racism via individual consequences, but that we need to go back to programs of reparations, restitution, and redistribution. Thank you so much, Program Director.
Thank you very much. And I think these issues really say to us, we can't discuss them in 10 minutes, but you really hit the nail on the head. We have unresolved issues, unfinished business, and we've got to look at racism from a multidimensional perspective, especially in a country like ours, as you said, that has been based, our institutionalized system has been racism. So I'm hoping you will stay through to the questions and answer session, which we're going to have to cut drastically in a few minutes. But please allow me to thank Professor Madlingozi and simultaneously then move on to our next speaker, who has 10 minutes as well, who's Mr. Nishan Balton from the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation and the Anti-Racism Network of South Africa, and also been a partner and a continuously good partner, good collaborations between our department and the foundation. Mr. Balton is the Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation since its inception in 2008. He's been a community and political activist for over 40 years, with involvement ranging from teacher unionism, civic and sport organizing, youth activism, and formal and underground ANC activism. I was also an activist in the Transvaal Indian Congress and the United Democratic Front. He served as a city councillor in the Johannesburg Metro from 1995 to 1997, and he's previously worked in the public sector in Gauteng at the Office of the Premier in the Department of Local Government and Education. Mr. Balton, over to you, and you have 10 minutes.
No, thank you very much. It's hard following Professor Madlingozi because I think he's covered much of what needs to be said and part of what I'm going to be saying. But let me just start off by thanking the organizers for this. You know, this Anti-Racism Week was really a creation of the Mandela Foundation and the Kathrada Foundation about 8 years ago, when we looked at the fact that anti-racism work in this country was muted by and large, and secondly, there was no public expression of anti-racism activism. And it followed on from looking at the European network of the European Anti-Racism Network, who for years have held almost a month-long anti-racism program, culminating on the 21st of March. And globally, the 21st of March has a far higher degree of public mobilization against racism than we've ever seen in South Africa. And was one of the big driving forces for this. And you know, so I think that's just brief background. But one of the things that surprises me continuously is the fact that many of us here and many in the media seem to be surprised when there are incidents of racism in this country, or that the Human Rights Commission reports would reflect that as one of the highest reported incidents. And that says to me that we think we should have overcome this in 94, or that in 94, racism would have disappeared. I think, like Professor Madlingozi, I've always taken the approach, or we've taken the approach, that this issue is embedded into the DNA of our country, and will take generational work to, in fact, eradicate, if that is at all possible. Because much of it is systemic, and perhaps we will get to talk about that later. But much of it is also because as a country, we've not built the capacity to tackle racism. The number of anti-racism institutions in this country, you can count them on your hand. The dedicated anti-racism institutions who will do the research, training, education, advocacy, there are probably 3 or 4 only. Not even our foundation can be counted in, because this is only part of what we do, and even that on very minimal scale. So we should never be surprised. But I think our surprise also must take into account the global resurgence of just racism of the worst kind. And when I say that, I talk about the reemergence of people walking around with Nazi flags, with flags about all kinds of heroes of racists from across the world. You see this in India, you see it in Israel, the US, parts of the African continent as well. And in fact, it's a global phenomenon that we need to take into account. And one of the things that we need to be realizing is that these right-wing races have a global connection. They share experiences, they share ideas, and they share a response to issues, which is why you will see a pushback on educational efforts where they have been in our schools to introduce anti-racism education. There's been a pushback modeled very much on the kind of pushback that you see in the US today. So I think that's the one point. I've been asked to talk about leveraging the public service as a tool for combating racism. I'm not sure that I can do that. But in the process, I do think that the Department of Justice stands out as a model on the resilience that it takes to keep anti-racism on the agenda. Had it not been for the work that the DOJ unit has done, we would never have realized the National Action Plan. And one of the things we need to acknowledge is that South Africa made this commitment in 2001, but only developed and approved the National Action Plan some 18 years later. And that's because this was just not taken seriously. And we must ask why. I think it took a dedicated unit in the DOJ and externally to continually advocate for this, to push for it. And eventually we have a plan. But the plan itself, its implementation, I'm hoping at some point we would be able to understand what are the difficulties and the complexities. And I can tell you one that I am aware of is that there's just very minimal resources dedicated to this kind of work that needs to be done, which is why elements of the plan would not have come about. So in terms of the public service, I mean, we're talking here about between 1.2, if you include local government, it's probably 1.6 million people who constitute what is called the public service. It is a phenomenal amount of people who, with the right kind of training, the right kind of consciousness, we should have been able to have made huge strides to at least at one level to have removed or reduced the kind of personalized racism that everybody seems to talk about. But at a more deeper level would have been to have used that kind of institutional power to have looked at the policy failures and the policy weaknesses in terms of implementation that changes the kind of mindsets that are required to reduce or eliminate racism in this country. And so what am I talking about here? is the point that I think has been raised, is a public sector that's indifferent to the lives of Black people by and large. You know, I serve on the board of a drug rehab center, which is totally 100% Black people that it serves. This center almost closed down in the last few days, and it has been going for 15 years or not. And why? It's because some bureaucrats in some office didn't sign off on some paper to release the last quarterly tranche of the payments. No effort to in fact phone and find out what is happening. And it takes it to get to a crisis point before somebody has to appeal to the head of department, who then tries to get involved to sort this out. Now, if this had been a kind of conscious public servant who said that this is an institution who serves predominantly Black people, what is happening here? How do I get this sorted out? That is a day-to-day occurrence across the public sector. I don't think any public sector worker or public servant would tolerate the kinds of things that have been spoken about here. The mass corruption that you see, the mass failure to deliver quality services, but worst of all is the treatment afforded to particularly Black people at public institutions is just horrible. So I'm not sure where the research has been or what research has been done about the kind of consciousness of public servants and their actual understanding of the racism and anti-racism and their responsibilities in that regard. You look at what's happening in Durban at the moment. Public servants destroying public infrastructure, which again serves predominantly poorer and Black people. But whether it's even if that were not the case, for public servants to be engaged in that kind of stuff says to you much about how they understand the consciousness of these public servants. So there's an emerging issue, which is really consciousness raising work that needs to be done at a much higher level. So I'm not sure what the Public School of Government does, whether it's a one-day course, a one-hour course, or how sustained that kind of work is throughout the life of a public servant, and would certainly want to begin to look at that. If you look at our schools, where a number of these anti-race or racist incidents takes place, as we sit here, to the best of my knowledge, there is no national anti-racism policy that guides how schools must work, or that takes teachers and SGBs and everybody else through a systematic training program. Now, in the absence of that, we shouldn't be surprised at what we then begin to read about. I'm surprised that, in fact, the numbers are as low as they are. Although I think one incident is one incident too many. But it should never surprise us that that is there. Public servants and xenophobia, I think public servants are in a bind when politicians themselves fuel xenophobia through their comments and policy proposals. It makes it difficult for public servants to begin to speak out. So what is it that the state must do to reduce racism in our country? And whether public servants are mindful when they weaken the state and do the things that they do, how much they have opened up the room for racism to re-emerge in this country. And it's not the raw racism of the past. So to conclude, there was mention made of young people. Let me say that we run an annual anti-racism essay writing competition in which thousands of young people take part. And I think if that kind of work can be extended across all of the schools in this country, and the writings from there were actually read and understood by public servants, you will see the the deep expression of racism that from many of the young people across the length and breadth of this country, and their kinds of hopes and requirements and calls for support from teachers, from the public sector in general. Lastly, we talk a lot about the need for dialogue, but I don't see where that dialogue is happening across race in our country, and whether in fact we have the capacity and the ability to manage that. Professor Madlingozi talks about the Phoenix State. I am aware of all of the efforts that communities there have done to deal with their issues through dialogue, but very little supported by the state, even at a local or national level, to sustain those dialogues and programs. So it's not as if those things were not happening. There's a wonderful project called Dialogue for Action, particularly this is a white Afrikaner initiative reaching out across race. Very little profile. The point I'm making here is that we can single out instances of racism, but I think we must also highlight the work that is perhaps being done to change some of this and find ways to support and scale that up so that it counters the perception that racism is not being challenged. But
Mr. Balton, I'm gonna have to ask you to end, please. Yes.
Very last point. 1.5 million public servants. How do you use that power to effect change and effect it in a sustained way, as I think has been alluded to? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really very difficult to stop all of the speakers because you're raising such important issues. And I think for the next time, we need to have a bit of a longer session, not necessary, and maybe a one in person. But thank you to all the speakers, and thank you, Mr. Balton. You've raised some really important questions there that I think we need to, it comes across through all of the research, the recent commissions of inquiry, that we need to expand on the raising the level of consciousness about being tolerant, but also, as we say that, do we have the capacities and do we have the ability to actually deal with racism? We know we do, it's not appropriate, we know it mustn't happen, we know when we're experiencing, but how we resolve it seems to be a bit of an issue. We've only got 15 minutes and I still have 2 more items on the agenda. So I'm going to open the questions up. So please start putting your questions into the Q&A box so our panelists can answer. I will allow us to have at least 14 minutes of question and answers. And if all the panelists and those listening in could please bear with us because we might go over 10 minutes, no more, because I know everybody else has other very hectic schedules and took time to come here through today. So I'm waiting for some questions, and to any one of the panelists, please let us hear what they are. And there's one question, anonymous attendee. Racism needs to be dealt with from both sides. I have noticed a rise in reverse racism incidents in South Africa. Racism does not only apply to the previously marginalized. And then there's a response there, agreed, from the Department of Justice, agreed both sides should speak out against racism. Any one of the panelists wanna pick up on that? You just raise your hand, please. I'm not seeing anyone. There's another question here is, my experience at times in some offices is that being a non-African is a problem, as you're not always treated the same as African officials and you do not take the matter up as it is the most senior manager who does that, and subordinates are protected if they act out against a non-African, even if it is a manager. And then one other question that comes up is, why is there, I think we raised that question earlier. So I'm not seeing any other questions and answers. No one has.
Director, if I can quickly try and
yes, please
answer the first question. You know, on that addressing the problem of racism should be dealt with from both sides. I think that that question is appropriate insofar as our understanding that we need to acknowledge that we are socialized, and conditioned to internalize racism. So which basically means that the end result is that those who are supremacists, in this racist kind of space, are operating successfully because they find the kind of recipients of their supremacy, with an attitude of inferiority. So that is what then sustains this problem, that we find ourselves in. So, but the reality is that we are the ones who must then take the lead in addressing these kinds of problems, because we can't simply just assume that it is normal. I always want to argue that human beings generally, under the circumstances of colonialism, tend to be zombified into that kind of racist kind of existence. So they need to be pulled out rather than expectation that they can do so on their own. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm seeing 4 questions here, but yeah.
So, Program Director.
Yes, you want to come in, Professor Madlingozi? Go ahead. Could you
Yes.
also in a response also maybe do a closing remark? I'm sorry to do this to all of you, simply because we're going to run out of time. So please go ahead.
Okay, just 2 things. One, just to say that, on the issue of reverse racism, it is true that we have programs aimed at advantaging previously disadvantaged groups. So I hope that's not what the person is talking about, that where we have, programs of affirmative action, BEE, as mandated by the Constitution, those should not be construed as reverse racism. But of course, for us as the Human Rights Commission, we are always, open to receiving any complaints of racism. But I just want to caution that, programs that are mandated by Section 9 of the Constitution aimed at, fixing historical imbalances should not be construed as reverse racism. As I conclude, Program Director, I just want to bring to the attention of the participant that as the Human Rights Commission, after the July 2021 unrest, we decided to institute a program called SHINE, Social Harmony Through National Effort, which is a program really aimed at, fostering dialogue, fostering harmony, because of course, you cannot, resolve the question of racism unless there is intercultural and interracial dialogue. So this program that we came up with, SHINE, really aims not just to investigate issues of racism, but to create harmony between the 2 groups. And we will, certainly be rolling out this program, and we'll let you know about it. Thank you so much, Program Director.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be very inappropriate, and because I don't see any further questions. And if Mr. Bolton, you're fine with me not coming back to you to do a closing remark, in fairness to me, I did give you an extra few minutes. I would rather than just hand over to do a summary and a way forward to Ms. Fransman. So sorry, panelists. We just have to manage the time a little bit carefully. And before I hand over to Ms. Dannelien Fransman, who is the Chief Director of Social Justice and Social Cohesion Participatory Democracy in the department, I wanted to just say thank you, and grateful I am that this project has been going forward. I know as someone who's just taken over the branch within which this Chief Directorate falls, I cannot take the accolades for the hard work that Mr. Bolton has raised. So I want to echo the same sentiments, simply because I did try to even postpone this seminar because we're having this major human rights conference, but they were very persistent that it has to stay. So the unwavering support, commitment to this issue hasn't gone unnoticed. And It really has been phenomenal to the Chief Director and the team that has been in support. There's much more work to be done, but very grateful on that in that regard. I also want to end by saying I think there's from my side, lots of very important points that have come up. I'm sure Ms. Fransman will raise this, but we will certainly look at how we follow up on in terms of the questions that have come up and those that may have remained unanswered, to respond to them in different formats throughout the year and take some of the recommendations, especially as we in government go into formulating the next 5-year strategy. And one of the things we're certainly going to emphasize on is expanding and intensifying the support to social cohesion, especially as we raise consciousness, but also be more pragmatic in managing social cohesion, respect for tolerance and equality. So with that said, I'm going to hand over to Danaline Fransman. Ms. Kaunda, I hope I haven't usurped your responsibilities, but thank you very much to all of you from my side.
Thank you, no problem at all. Let's hand over to Ms. Danaline Fransman to do the summary and way forward.
Thank you very much, DDG, and all esteemed colleagues and everyone who is participating in today's events. Unfortunately, with some technical challenges, I will not be using the camera, so bear with me while I just use the audio function. Briefly, my task is to summarize some of the points made. We had a number of very interesting, very insightful reflections and inputs from the different speakers. So because of time, I shall just highlight the key points. In terms of the keynote speaker, Advocate Tlakula, for example, referred to existing reports from the Human Rights Commission emanating from public hearings and investigations, which are still evidently apparent and relevant today. So there is a need for us to work with the Human Rights Commission to revisit those reports and to ensure that those recommendations are implemented. Some observations from the Officer of the High Commission for Human Rights, which emphasized the importance of the collection of disaggregated data for the measurement of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And I'm happy to say that that is work that is already in progress. The importance of collaboration and partnerships has come through from across the different inputs and speakers, and as well the need for dialogues, intercultural dialogues across different race groups, age groups, etc. Very heartened I was also by the input made by the DPSA. I think it really assists to strengthen the work that we are doing as the Department of Justice, as the focal agency for the National Action Plan. And that is to, for example, activities that will be required to be conducted by various departments to strengthen the marking of Anti-Racism Week, also looking at the collection of data to support transformation efforts, and also implementing programs to ensure that there is a feeling of belonging for all members or officials within the public sector, because of course the saying goes that charity begins at home, and once there is transformation and respect for diversity within, we would then be able to more effectively deliver services to the public out there in line with the Batho Pele principles. From the Public Service Commission, again, some very insightful comments about the differences between covert and overt or subliminal forms of racism and discrimination, and that indeed these can take various forms, and the need again for public servants to respect each other, and therefore by extension the rights of the members of the public that we as public servants have to serve and respect and protect. Also, the issue of the management of internal within the public sector discrimination cases, that is a reality, that it does impact on service delivery, and that there is a need to be sensitive about that, and for such cases to be dealt with decisively, to create precedents and really to set an example. From the Human Rights Commission, Professor Madlengozi again rightfully pointed out that South African context is quite unique given its history, and a number of points made about racism, that it in itself is a symptom but not the root cause, and that there are a number of underlying issues and remaining challenges that we need to deal with, as well as the linkage between the remaining socioeconomic inequalities that impact on our respect for each other, and therefore the protection and promotion of human rights. Again, the need for an intersectoral approach, but also recognizing intersectionalities. The need from Mr. Bolton from the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. Yes, the fact that racism seems to be embedded in our DNA, that it is a systemic issue, that we indeed do need to build the capacity within the country to deal with the issues of racism. So, some of those issues are quite pertinent, and for us as the unit within the department who will be tasked with developing the next 5-year program of action, these are quite critical issues that we will need to take on board. With the NSG, our partner as well, there is already this course that is available online for senior managers at this point, but it is noted and agreed that perhaps we need to extend that across the department and really have something that is quite intensive and intentional as well. Also looking at, is there a national anti-racism, within departments, policies. Those are issues that we need to look at, and also certainly in line with the discussion about collaborating. There are a number of activities that were mentioned by the different speakers. For example, the Ahmed Kathrada anti-racism essay writing competition. We already know about the Human Rights Commission's SHINE project that we already have had some initial discussions about. And then also the Public Service Commission. For example, there is this program that some workshops were held, I think it was the end of last year, and we'll certainly be looking at how those programs and activities can conclusion. And in terms of the way forward, this is a recorded session. It will be available on various social media platforms. We intend to prepare a report based on the comments and the recommendations that were made. And as we move into the new financial year, planning, as the DDG has said, the next medium-term development plan, which is a 5-year plan aligned to the National Action Plan Program of Action, we will take all these inputs into consideration, and we'll be counting on the various partners, departments, and other stakeholders to assist us to ensure the effective implementation of the National Action Plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that wrap up. And we have come, therefore, to the conclusion of a very successful and fruitful discussion on this important topic in our country, combating racism, which also marked in which we also marked Anti-Racism Week, which runs from today until the 21st of March. And there will probably be a number of activities also in other departments marking this important period in our country, especially since we are also in the 30th year of our freedom and democracy. I would therefore like to thank all our panelists. We really appreciate the fact that you took time to join us today, make preparations and do the presentations. Therefore, we really thank you and look forward to working with you in the future. We thank our partners, the Department of Justice as well. We've worked very well together to put this program together. We also acknowledge our partners and participants also that we didn't acknowledge before. I see we've got Professor Siphamandla Zondi from UJ, the CEO of the SA Human Rights Commission has also joined us, Fusumuzi Mkhize, and also our key partner in the presidency through Ms. Lusanda Mxenge, DDG there. We look forward to working with all of you in taking this program together. As said before, and I'm happy that in her closing remarks, Ms. Fransman also alluded to this, that the NSG is running a program called Championing Anti-Discrimination in the Public Service, because we believe, as much as we are all aware of racism, xenophobia, homophobia, and all related intolerances, but it is important to also go through formal training so that we're able to identify it, to be able to combat it within the public service. Our panelists have spoken very strongly about the need for a public service that is free of racism. For example, how do we make sure that in the delivery of services, we do not discriminate against communities, and that we lead as a public service in promoting equality, and also in making sure that the laws that have been put in place in our country to fight racism are implemented in the correct manner. So we look forward to having most of our participants today, if not in fact all of you, doing this course, Championing Anti-Discrimination in the Public Service. It's online. You can access this through our website, online at your own pace. Nobody will time you. You can finish it as quickly as possible. But we thank all our participants. Without you, there would be no webinar. Everybody who took time to join us today. Your participation is much appreciated. We have therefore come to the end, and we therefore adjourn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Program Director.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.